Hello and welcome to this first video explaining modern monetary economics. This video aims to convey the most basic and foundational aspects, such as the relationship between productive capacity of an economy and spending in the economy. We'll also look at the most basic way money gets into the economy, which is termed injection, and how money can go out of the economy, which is called draining. We'll illustrate the economy using three people who are producing things. Each of our people sells goods to the next person. This flow of goods is represented by black arrows. At the same time, money will flow in the opposite direction. This is illustrated by the outer green arrows. The diagram shows that each person's income is also what they spend, and that one person's spending is another person's income. The circulation of money is akin to what economics calls GDP. In our example, each person is working 8 hours and produces 8 units of goods, which they want to sell. They are happy to receive $1 per unit for their goods. In order for all their production to be sold, each customer has to have $8 in order to purchase all the goods. So in order to have all 24 units of production being consumed around the economy, there must be $24 circulating in the economy. What happens if we have a bit of economic growth? Consider where our people want to work 10 hours per day now, and as a result they produce 10 units of goods. They're still happy to receive $1 per unit. How much money do we need in the economy in order that all the produced goods can be sold? That's right, $30. Again, our economy is all nicely set up as the money circulating in it matches nicely so that all the goods being produced can circulate too. What about another form of growth? This time we'll look at an extra producer. We go back to the 8-hour days again and we'll go from that. If our new person works 8 hours and produces 8 units of goods, then if there is no new money in the economy, no one can buy the goods. If we inject some money into it though, then it would solve the problem. Let's say we inject $8. Then if we have enough money in the economy for all the produced goods to be sold, and that's what happens, and everyone's happy. Let's go back to our three people and $8 being spent. Now let's imagine they all want to save $2. That only leaves $6 to spend. So each person can only buy 6 units of produce. This leaves each a bit dissatisfied that they can't sell their full production. If we again inject some money, like $2 each, then each person can again sell their full production, and they're even happier now because they have some savings and they are able to sell their full production. I just want to introduce an even simpler view of the economy than what we've looked at so far. So we're familiar with an economy being circulating money with the possibility of a drain on it. In this case it was to savings. We've also covered that there can be injections, illustrated by the blue arrow in this diagram. It's important to note that if injections are less than the drains, the amount of money circulating in the economy decreases and the full productive capacity won't be able to be sold. Similarly, if the injections are larger than the drains, the amount of money in circulation will build up and this will cause prices to inflate. It's like we saw with the scales diagram. The production capacity needs to be matched with the spending. I like to reiterate lots so people gain a solid understanding. So I'll present the scenarios again slightly differently. Here we have a table. In the first row, the production of 24 units is matched with the money being $24. The result is an optimal economy. All the production capacity is being sold and there is no inflation. In the second row, I've kept the production capacity the same at 24 units, but I've reduced the amount of money to $20. This is not a balanced economy. The productive capacity of the economy is not used up, so there will be less people employed than in the first scenario, and some of the productive capacity, I've just used the term factory because that's something that people can picture better, is sitting unused. In the third scenario, once again the production has stayed the same, but this time the amount of money has increased. In this scenario, what would typically happen in the economy is that there would be a bit of inflation. There's a couple other scenarios that we could have looked at here, involving changes to the production side of things, but we'll leave them for the moment and do them later when we look at inflation in a bit more detail. So we'll go back to our circulation, injection and drain diagram, but now we're going to represent it slightly differently in preparation for looking at some scenarios that involve more practical injections and drains. So the first diagram we'll use is a single injection, single drain diagram. And then in even more advanced scenarios later on, we'll use a version with a circle representing the economy and have 4 injection and drain sources. The square in the first diagram and the circle in that second diagram represents the triangle in the examples we've looked at previously. Before we look at these scenarios though, it is time for us to consider something we've avoided so far. Where does the money come from? Who or what supplies it? Let's start to answer that before we go any further. I can think of 4 options for groups in our economy that could supply the money. I know 3 of these won't work, so let's look at why that is. Our 3 options are private citizens, private businesses and banks. In the private citizens case, which means you, me and the families in our communities, let's imagine a situation where each household was duly doing its national duty and creating, let's say, $500 per week. Then one week, one person gets a neat idea. What if I just create an extra $50? That will give me a bit more to spend for no extra work. No one will notice. Do I even need to say where this is going to go? We know where it goes. Everyone will keep ratcheting up the money supply and pretty soon we'll have a massive inflation problem. So we can't let private citizens make the money supply. Let's look at option 2, private businesses. So each private business is creating $2,000 per week and spending it on things which become others' income and so on and so forth. The thing is, the objective of a private business is to make a profit. Now imagine one business manager is a bit jealous of the nice car another business manager has. So he just pumps out a bit more money each week and books it as profit. Pretty soon he has made a nice lot of profit and buys himself a nice car. Next minute, the first business manager has an even nicer car. I wonder how he did that. Anyway, we can see where this is going to end up again. What about option 3, private banks? Private banks suffer from the same problem as private businesses. They are in the business of making profit, making money. You can't have entities whose job it is to make money, making the money that the economy needs. So private banks can't make the money supply either. To avoid some future confusion, if people are trying to relate their learning here to the real world, I'll mention now that in the actual economy, banks do create some money. However, this is under what amounts to a license, and that license comes with some conditions ensuring the banks are somewhat controlled in the money they make. So we know we have, as the result of our cooperation and combined productivity, an economy which requires money to function. We know that whoever is in the group that controls the money supply must have an amount of self-control and accountability to all of us, considering it's our combined effort that makes the economy in the first place. We also need them to use the spending power in ways that bring the most benefit to the country and its people. Now, luckily for us, these 2 aspects have already been invented. The selection of a group of representatives we're happy with, or perhaps tolerant of, might be a better way to put it, is done via democracy. The democratic process selects a set of representatives, which then form government, which is the group that we use to enact the spending power and use it wisely. The government controls the laws, including the laws involving money. We only have to look at the Mint being a government-controlled entity to give us one clue as to the government's authority over money. As we've seen with the recent investigation into banks in Australia, the banks need to abide by the laws, or they may receive fines and penalties, and the leaders of the banks can go to jail if they disobey the government's laws. That hasn't happened in Australia as far as I'm aware, but Iceland did jail some of its bank leaders as a result of the crash of their banks at the time of the GFC. If it so chooses, the Australian government can also control the Reserve Bank, which we'll talk about more later. Currently there is some separation between them, but if the government chose to close that separation, it could, as easily as changing the laws that require the separation. So, let's look at this money injection by the government and start to learn some more details about that. The government could just give money to the people and inject it that way. That isn't out of the question, but it's an unwise option. There is a better method which allows the government to spend on useful things for the population. This involves purchasing goods from the economy with the government spending power. The government pays the money to the producers, and then the money can circulate around in the economy as required to use up the productive capacity in it. This is especially good for getting things built and staffed, which are things that are shared or needed by the whole population, and or which the population would have trouble organising itself. Things such as road infrastructure, power supply, water supply, communication systems, the education system, and hospitals and the health system. The way the government puts money in and takes money out of the economy is very important for our understanding of how the economy works. This gives me a chance to show you the cover of one of my favourite books, Everything is Obvious, with an asterisk, which stands for once you know the answer. The book title is highlighted not for the message it is saying, but for rather the opposite, that if you don't have the answer, things are not necessarily obvious at all. Prior to something being worked out by someone, things can be anything but obvious. And this is how it is when it comes to government spending and taxing into the economy and how these work. When trying to investigate and understand things, what typically happens is we start out from things we already know. This is just a natural human way of doing things. When people first started to think about how money works at the level of the whole country, they used the experiences they had of their own financial situations as a useful starting point. In our own situation, we get our income from working at a job. That income allows us to spend. In the case of a government, people noted that when it collected taxes, that this was money coming into it, like an income. The government could then spend this money. It should be noted that by the time people began investigating this stuff through the 16 and 1700s, that the money systems were already quite complex and it was hard to track what was going on. Plus, the people that tended to investigate these things were private citizens, and they didn't have good access to all the goings-on of government monetary systems. So, although the early thinkers on money went with the obvious, that tax was the government's income and that spending was its spending, like for an individual, it turned out that this is wrong. So, not everything is obvious. It turns out that it's exactly the opposite to how they thought it was, and this matters a lot. So the spending comes at first and puts money into the economy, and the taxing comes second and takes money out of the economy. By now, we have several points in support of this new version being the correct case. One example is the use of tally sticks. For something to be good to use for money, it needs to be something that is cheap to make, hard to counterfeit, and easy to carry and exchange. The tally stick was an early version of this. The sticks were broken, and it wasn't easy to come up with an identical stick that would match back up. So the lords knew they could see if people had tried to make some fake money. So in days past, feudal lords used to get their workers to use their own tally stick currency. They'd give them out as payment when they paid the farmers for their produce. When it came tax time, they'd expect the sticks back and could easily check that the sticks matched, and that stopped anyone from trying any forgery. This kept the currency in a closed loop. Note that the sticks have to go out first before any can be demanded back. That is, the money, the tally sticks, were spent into the economy first and taxed back second. It's simply impossible for it to be any other way. The old way, tax then spend, also suffers from what I call the initialization problem. Imagine there is no money in the economy. This means there is no money to tax. How can an economy ever get going from this state? Simply put, someone has to put some money in first before anyone can ever be taxed. I imagine some of you might have some doubts about this tax being taking money out of the economy thing, and I guess considering all the chatter we all would have heard over the years about how taxes for spending, I don't blame you. I'll talk a bit more about tax and the things it does after this next section. For now though, we're going back to look at our two-component injection and drain diagram from earlier, and we'll look at the injections and the drains just associated with the government. So our first slide shows the effects of a spending increase and a taxing increase. A government spending increase is one of these injections we have been talking about previously. The only drain we talked about previously was a scenario where people put some money away in savings, but another form of drain is a tax increase by the government. You can see that if we care about how much money is circulating in the economy, and we're trying to get that right, then an approach with a spending increase and a taxing increase isn't particularly useful as they cancel each other out. On our next slide, we can see the other possible scenarios that a government could do. A spending decrease, which is like the savings or tax increase we looked at earlier and is a drain of money from the economy, whereas a tax cut is an injection. This is similar to the previous slide though, in that the two things the government is doing cancel each other out to an extent. Just to make clear, if a government really wanted to inject money into an economy because there is not enough of it recirculating, then the strongest way to do that is a spending increase and a tax cut at the same time. If they instead need to drain excess money out of circulation, as perhaps there is too much and inflation is likely, then the best combination to do that is a spending decrease and a taxing increase at the same time. Something that's funny for me is the case of the two Australian major parties who consider themselves polar opposites when it comes to economics. The thing is, if I put the first two scenarios we looked at up on the one slide, then the LNP behave just like the bottom case. They do tax cuts, but they also do spending cuts, which, as we discussed, tend to cancel each other out. The Labor Party are more like the top one. They do plenty of spending, but keep taxes where they are or raise them. Both parties just leave the economy ambling along without ever caring too much about what injections should be done, and it is usually injections that are needed. Despite their views of themselves as being opposites, they are, economically, pretty similar lately. So the net effect of a government depends on the differences between spending and taxes. If spending is greater than taxes, it results in an injection of money into the economy. Conversely, if spending is less than taxes, it takes money out of the economy. Here's where we run into a bit of a problem though. The terminology used to describe what is happening with the government's position is made through the old household analogy. So have a look at the analogy again. Tax comes first, spending goes second. So if we have an injection where spending is greater than taxing, which I'll put on the old analogy, because they think of it the incorrect way, the opposite way, they will call that a deficit. So since everything, all the literature already out there in circulation for the last 50 plus years, all uses this terminology, I'll have to stick with it. The thing to remember is that a deficit, which sounds like a shortage of something, is not that at all. It is an injection, an addition to the economy. Similarly, a surplus, which sounds like an increase or an extra amount, is actually a subtraction or drain of money out of the economy. Sorry, but until the world adjusts to the correct ways spending and taxing are, we are stuck using the terminology that is basically an opposite of reality. Given that we've talked a lot about tax, it is probably time to give a quick overview of the purposes tax serves. That's right, purposes, with an S, a plural. Tax does more than one thing. In fact, it has a range of uses, but we'll talk about the main four. The first one is the most basic purpose of tax, and that is to create demand for money. It seems crazy these days that anyone would consider using anything other than Australian dollars in Australia, but there were times in the past, and possibly again with cryptocurrency in the future, that there were realistic alternatives to the government's money. Once you force tax to be payable in your money, everyone who has to pay tax is forced to obtain some of those dollars, and so ensures your money is what's used in the economy. Another purpose of tax, the one most similar to how people traditionally think it is like allowing some expenditure. So there is a way where you can sort of say tax helps spending, but it's not by providing money, it's by taking away other money so that those private businesses and people can't spend that money on goods the government needs to perform its duty supplying public facilities and services. This form of purchasing is a form which strongly inhibits inflation from occurring, which is a very sensible way of doing things. The most sensible way for a government to do things, but we'll talk about that a lot more later. Taxes can also be used to inhibit certain economic activities that we as a population, and therefore the government as our agent, thinks is unwise. Taxes on smoking is an example of this. Another example is redistribution. So economics, even modern monetary economics, is far from a complete science, and we suspect that the system is set up incorrectly and awards some with too much and others with too little, and this damages the overall productivity of the economy. Instead of resolving the mammoth task of fixing all the internal workings of the economy to correct this, we can just say bugger it. We'll fix it at the end by using tax to correct money away from those with too much to those with less than optimal. Lastly, tax can be used, as we've mentioned a number of times already, as a general thing to drain money from the circulation from an economy which had an imbalance between that and its productive capacity. This can be used to control inflation if necessary. Okay, so one last thing we'll look at on injections and drains is what we'd have to do in terms of running the government budget to suit a growing economy. So I've generated a table and I've got a column simply called economy. That's the size of the economy, its productive capacity. We'll start it at 24, so it's like the triangle diagram from earlier. There are 24 units of goods that are circulating in it. We'll also assume that there is $24 in circulation in year one as well, which is to say our economy is nicely balanced in terms of spending to production. Each year, the economy is going to grow by 1 unit of production. I'm going to mock up some scenarios that keep the government spending increasing by 1 unit each year to keep the spending in balance with the production. So here is my result. In year 2, we have a government spending $3 but taxing $2, leaving $1 in the economy to match with the 1 unit of production. The next year, it looks like we have a Liberal national government because they've cut spending and cut taxes. However, the difference between the two is still $1, so again, this is okay. In year 4, we still have the LNP government, and they've cut the spending again. They've also cut taxes, this time to zero. There is still $1 of government spending, so that is an injection of $1 overall and keeps us matched with our increasing productive capacity. In the fifth and final year, it looks like we have a Labor government. They've increased the spending, but they've also raised taxes back up a bit too. The difference between them though is still $1, and so in this year as well, we balance our spending with our productive capacity properly. The reason we've looked at this diagram is to highlight that the effect of the government on the economy is the net result of the difference between its spending and its taxing. In the next section, where we look at the four-component model of the economy, we'll stop considering the government's spending and taxing individually and just consider their overall effect as to whether they inject money or drain money from the economy. In our more complicated four-component model of the economy, we will start to consider some extra sectors which can drain money out of or inject it into the recirculating load of money in the economy. We've covered both the top two things next to the circle, the government and private savings, although we only just touched on private savings back earlier with the triangle diagrams. The other two things are the current account and private debt. The current account is like the trade balance, except it considers even more things, like, say, the payments we receive for educating foreign students at our universities, or the money being sent home by foreign workers here on visas in Australia. The current account is the summary of all of our foreign dealings. Private debt is the borrowings by the private sector, which includes people, households and businesses. All four of these things is capable of both injecting money in and draining it out. Here again, it is difficult to use the widely used terminology to explain what is going on with these things in terms of their effect of injecting to or draining from the economy. Sometimes the same term will have the opposite effect. For example, a government deficit will put money into the economy, whereas a current account deficit takes it out. I know, it's painful, so I'll run through and give a description of the terminology and its effect. After this, we'll look at some real data on the Australian economy and use our four-component model to understand what's going on. So a government deficit puts money in and a surplus takes money out. A decreasing government deficit, so a smaller and smaller deficit, say $50 one year and then a deficit of $25 the following year, also takes money out. So that's one you have to be careful of, relative movements, not just absolute levels. Australia's current account is pretty much always in deficit, so relative movements here become important. An increasing deficit is a drain and a decreasing deficit is an injection. With private debt, increasing private debt results in an injection, whereas decreasing private debt, that is paying off the debt, is a drain. Decreasing private savings is an injection into the economy, out of our piggy banks and into the economy. The opposite is true. Savings increase is a drain on the economy. Here is a series of graphs showing key elements of the Australian economy running from 1976 to now. The top graph is the current account deficit. We have relatively little control over this one, so I've put it up the top out of the way so we can more carefully compare the bottom four. The next one down is the government budget balance, which we have a great deal of control over, and that's what we should be using to manage our economy. The next two, the household savings ratio and private debt, tend to respond to what's being done by the government. The bottom graph is the GDP growth. This tells us the response of the economy to all the other components, and in short, if too much money is pulled out, it will drop, and when it drops too low, it's a recession. Looking at these graphs can be a bit like when your doctor shows you your own x-ray and says, "Wow, look at this obvious thing," and you're like, "I can't see anything." It takes a bit to get used to them. So we'll start off with the easiest and most obvious bit to read, and I'll use little graphics to point things out along the way, and then we'll gradually work to the harder stuff. So the first bit we'll look at is the period from 1997 to 2008. I've highlighted it with the blue panel there. You'll see that on the second graph down, our government budget balance graph, it was in the positive. That is, it's a net surplus, which we know now means the opposite. It is a drain of money out of the circulation. We can see the obvious effect this had on savings in the next graph down. Right when the surpluses were, it drained us dry of savings. This is what I meant when I said savings was like a responder to money going out of the economy. When it goes out, we run down our savings and that keeps the economy going. There's a few problems with this though, with the most obvious being, once we, as a population, are out of savings, there's no more we can do. And if still other areas take more money out of circulation, growth will fall. In this same time period, there was a steady increasing of the private debt. That is another response to the drain of money out of the economy by the government. Also with private debt, you'll notice I put in a horizontal bar at 150% of GDP. In the end of this period, the private debt has risen to be just on or above that line. The line indicates a level of private debt above which economies tend to have economic crashes related to having too much debt. In the GFC, countries which had private debt levels of more than 150% of GDP were the ones that crashed. This line is like the zero line for private savings. Once you get here, you can't really go any further. I'll represent this on our 4-component diagram. As money was pulled by the government, savings decreased in order to inject money, and private debt also increased to put money in. The next parts we'll look at are either side of the first period. In the periods both before and after 97 to 2008, there were deficits in the government budget balance. This meant there would have been an injection into the economy. In the period 2008 to 2012, you can see that private savings was able to go back up in a reversal of what we saw happen in the last example. Also in this period, we can see that private debt dropped back away from the limit it had reached before. You'll see pretty much a carbon copy in the 1992 to 1996 period. Private savings stays constant and debt stays fairly constant. We can understand this with our 4-component model. There was an injection in by the government with its deficit position, and savings and private debt were able to respond. This means people and businesses took the opportunity to get themselves to safer ground financially once the economy allowed it. They saved a bit and reduced debt. The next period we'll look at is from 1983, which is when the modern monetary economics period begins, because we have a floating exchange rate, up to 1991. If you look at the government budget balance chart, you will see in this time period the deficits rapidly decrease and eventually a surplus is attained. Even if the balance is not yet in surplus, but the deficit is declining rapidly, this has the effect of draining money from the economy. You can see this in the response of the private savings in the early part of this period from 1984 to 87. Private debt was pretty steadily rising over the period, but you can see right at the end, in a last gasp, it jumped up. But it was too late by then. If you look at the last 3 columns of growth graph down the bottom, you can see it was dropping rapidly, and in 1991, the growth turned negative and there was a recession. The last part we'll look at is the period 2013 till now. Again, we'll start with what the government balance is doing. It shows a declining deficit. This means it is pulling money out of the economy again. Again, we can see that private savings is decreasing. Similarly, private debt has risen and it is right back against its limit. We can see the effect this is having with growth, having decreased it down over the last 3 columns. This is all with a pretty favourable current account too. I know we've ignored that one for the most part, but you can see here that the current account deficit has decreased, and this has helped inject money into the economy and keep growth up better than it would have been otherwise. I'll just quickly show what that looks like on the 4-component diagram. So we have 3 things injecting money in, with just the government, which doesn't need it, taking money out. If we continue on this path, it is hard to see us avoiding a recession. The only real question is, what triggers it? Is it the private debt? Is it running out of savings? Is it a switch around to an increasing current account? Okay, the last bit before a quick recap. The Australian economy is pretty hard to map out in terms of drains and injections and the effect on the economy. The US economy, however, is very simple. I've grabbed a diagram of the US budget balance over about the last 100 years. I've marked on the recessions with green bars up the top. I also put a red line in the middle when the US floated its currency and when the modern monetary economic period began for them. I'm going to chop the diagram off at this red line and just show you the right hand side. I've marked in the areas where deficits increase with orange trend lines. I've marked in the areas of decreasing deficits with black trend lines. I put orange question marks when the deficits reach their maximum. Have a look. The recessions that occur just after decreased deficits or when a surplus occurs. This is exactly what we'd expect. Drain money out via deficit decrease, and eventually there won't be enough circulating, and the economy, if you leave it for long enough, will recession. Okay, to recap. We have an economy which consists of people and machines with productive capacity. This productive capacity is utilised by money which circulates in the economy. We know that the best way to have an economy is when the money in circulation is in balance with the productive capacity. We know that the money in circulation is affected by injections and drains. In the government's case, it can use spending and tax to control what's coming into or out of the circulation. We know that the terminology is confusing, with some terms, due to historical misinterpretations, being the opposite of what they should be. To see a more complete picture of the sectors which affect the money in circulation, we used a 4-component model and saw, with empirical data, that the economy behaved as expected. We saw that if there were too many drains, especially when the government deficits got smaller, or there were surpluses, that eventually this decreased growth and increased the chance of recessions. This is a good foundation for understanding modern monetary economics, but this is only about half of what you need to know. The rest of it is, to me, the more interesting bits. You get to find out about even more unused government spending power that we have, that we could use to help fix all sorts of society's problems, if we so chose. Why we can have a job guarantee, and how inflation control plays an important part in both of these considerations. The good thing is that all these videos are only about 10 minutes long too, so you've done the hardest yards, it's downhill from here.